Okay, well, two things I'd just like to say first. One is to apologise for the amount of reading I've given you all, because, I should have cut it down a bit, so I apologise for that. And the second thing is to say that I'm not an expert in periodical culture, not like David or Greg. This is something that an interest I've developed tangentially, really, because I'm working on my first book was on Robert Bloomfield, who most of you have never heard of, I'm sure. Second, I've just published a book on romanticism in the rural community, and I'm currently working on a book on representations of witchcraft and magic in 19th century fiction, which is where my tangential interest in Edinburgh literary culture came from. Because I've just been writing a monograph chapter on Hogg, representations of witchcraft and magic in Hogg's fiction. And I began to think about whether Edinburgh literary culture and the networks within Edinburgh literary culture were distinctive or different from other literary networks. Other metropolitan literary networks such as London, but other literary networks in general. Because there seemed to be a sense at the time that Edinburgh literary culture was dominated by one figure, Walter Scott. Hogg certainly believed that this was the case in lots of ways. I mean, there's a famous story about Hogg introducing Scott to his mum. I mean, I'm sure most of you know about this. And Hogg's mum tore Scott off a strip, told him off for what he'd done in the minstrelsy of the Scottish border. Because Hogg's mum was very upset about the fact that he'd written down various ballads and songs, which, as far as she was concerned, were meant to be sung. And Hogg's work had destroyed them, really, because she didn't believe they were ever going to be sung again. So Hogg's mum had a good old go at Scott. The second complaint that Hogg had was that when Scott was writing poetry, everyone else had to write poetry because no one wanted to read fiction. As soon as Hogg switched from poetry to fiction, everyone else had to write fiction because no one wanted to read poetry. Then there's there's Hogg's Brownie the Bod's Beck. This was published shortly after Scott's Old Mortality, and Hogg was accused of ripping off Scott. But as Scott complained in his memoirs, I was working on my Brownie the Bod's Beck before Scott began to work on Old Mortality, and he complained about this again in his Anecdotes of Scott that were published shortly after Scott's death. And then there's Scott tourism, which, as Linda Watson's essay demonstrates, did have quite an impact on the way in which people interacted with and viewed the area around Loch Katrine. But Hogg's Highland Adventures suggests that Hogg's view about the impact of Scott tourism would have been slightly different, or considerably different, from Linda Watson's view about the impact of Scott tourism. This idea that Edinburgh literary culture was dominated by Scott has survived into modern criticism. Ian Duncan's really brilliant book on the impact, called Scott's Shadow, on the impact of Scott on fiction in Edinburgh in the Romantic period. Is all about the way in which he believed that other novelists were writing in Scott's shadow, as the title suggests. I mean, he argues that in Hogg's The Three Perils of Man, the warlock Michael Scott is actually Walter Scott, the novelist. The warlock Michael Scott in The Three Perils of Man is directing what goes on around his castle in the same way as Scott is directing what goes on in literary culture in Edinburgh and who does what and how they do it. I think there are problems with that reading of Three Perils of Man for lots of reasons, which I'm not going to go into now. And then periodical culture in Edinburgh. I sense, as I say, I'm not an expert in periodical culture, but I sense that it was distinctive in some interesting ways. That I don't think there's any other magazine or periodical like Blackwood's. Why did Blackwood's develop in Edinburgh? In what ways is Blackwood's magazine distinctive? In what ways did it shape Edinburgh literary culture? There were some incredible people involved in the production of Blackwoods, Gibson Lockhart mainly, but there are also some amazing contributors, including Hogg. Gibson Lockhart, as the essay on Blackwoods magazine suggests, has developed a reputation largely based upon his Cockney School of Poetry essays, but he was a much more diverse. He wasn't just a figure who attacked other writers. His writing and interests were much more diverse, and I think I think it was wrong. I agree with the essay really that it was wrong to equate his views with the views revealed in or put forward in the Cockney School of Poetry. The Noctes Ambrosiana, I mean, there's nothing else like that published in periodical writing in the Romantic period. On their own, I think they reveal lots of interesting things about the dynamics of Edinburgh literary culture, and also what makes Edinburgh literary culture, or what made Edinburgh literary culture different from other from English literary culture, from English literary culture. So the texts that I've chosen really are a selection of primary texts, a selection of secondary texts that are hopefully going to enable us to explore the dynamic of Edinburgh literary culture, the importance and role of Scott, and Hogg, who I think in lots of ways is actually as important a figure in Edinburgh literary culture as Scott. Blackwoods magazine, figures like Gibson Lockhart and Wilson. Wilson's reviews in Blackwoods magazine, I think they're amazing, his reviews. I don't think there was any another reviewer like Wilson, actually. It's incredible. So that's all I want to say really to introduce the seminar, and I hope we'll have a productive discussion. Okay, thank you. We'll start with group one, which is Will, Jane, John, Felicity and Cassandra.
So we didn't nominate a speaker, but we said I'll start speaking and they're going to chip in. Okay. We had a wide-ranging conversation, let's say. We enjoyed Scott Shadow, the chapter we read by Ian Duncan, and we thought it was pretty ambitious, particularly the large kind of allegorical frames over whole novels. Yeah. We had quite a bit of conversation about his reading of Confessions of a Justified Sinner, and how it's quite bold. In terms of answering the questions, I think the first question, what is the dynamic of Edinburgh literary culture? We all had most of us had conceptions of Edinburgh as a less single author driven literary culture, and much more as a kind of a space with lots of small players. Yeah. And yet, Duncan's thesis that Scott is actually a kind of omniscient presence in all these things. Yeah. And then we thought about the foundations of the Quarterly, which Scott was involved in, although Jane pointed out rightly that he wasn't the most reliable contributor when the Quarterly got going, that he obviously has a familiar link to Blackwoods. So that the statement of a shadow is quite a useful one, because although on the surface we seem to have a lot of, and a shadow is even more useful, as John pointed out, because of the anonymity that Scott absolutely, even in terms of handwriting, he'd make sure that his handwriting wasn't seen, etc., etc. Yeah. He's kind of the black hand over Edinburgh culture, a culture that we see as very diverse and, not to put this, but actually for someone like Hogg, who was in need of enabling, something we talked about a lot, that as a labouring, as a someone not from that scheme of life, he needed to be, even if he had the will to be successful, he needed enabling in a way Scott absolutely didn't. Yeah.
We just talked about, we thought it was a really interesting chapter, and we talked about Duncan's model of Hogg engaged in emulation and resistance to Scott. John pointed out that actually maybe we really need to consider Hogg separately and think about him as an independent figure, and that's maybe something that sometimes gets a bit obscured by these great creative allegorical readings that Duncan is doing.
I agree. I mean, I think they're very clever, but I mean, the one that I dislike the most, or I'm troubled by the most, is the allegorical reading of the Three Perils of Man. The idea of Michael Scott, the great warlock, as being Walter Scott, directing and controlling Edinburgh literary culture. And I think one of the reasons we don't see Scott as such an important figure is because he's not seen as one of the major writer for the Romantic period anymore. Yet, for a substantial period during the Romantic period, he was the main writer in the Romantic period.
And just on the consideration as Hogg being independent, we then discussed the kind of way that this really changes the way we look at Hogg if we look at him like Duncan does, because we've always thought of the Ettrick Shepherd, or in Carl Miller's biography as a kind of guy alone on a hill, who's, and John pointed out that he used to walk to Edinburgh, and there's a real sense of him as not being part of the literary culture, or as kind of separating himself from it, and this really puts him in the kind of, and there's that quote from the letter where he says about the banknotes.
It's actually in his persona as Mr. Spy. Is it right? That's a journal he brought out from his persona, which is saying that literature's like banknotes unless it's credited from a particular bank. So you either have to basically have your stuff in the stable of one author or another. I haven't put that quite well enough, but you're really stuck. You have to. It's party. You have to write like this or like that. Otherwise, nobody buys your books. They don't get published. There's no publicity. So he's always very aware that Edinburgh is dominated by one party or another, and you've got to.
And we thought that was different to London. But we thought that Edinburgh lent itself. Well, I thought actually this was. I don't know if everyone agreed, but that Edinburgh really lends itself to the kind of single monograph study in a way that London struggles to, because. Well, we thought there was a more aristocratic influence in London. There was more certain locational groups in London, so we had Cockneys, Hampstead, Lakers, and people put in their place. Whereas Edinburgh seems to have a critical mass that's big enough to have a thriving literary culture, but it's also small enough to force people to meet in a lot more kind of formal ways.
Okay, group 2, which was Stephen, Anna. Oh, actually, Mike, the group I was in. Anna's going to feedback.
So we were looking at Hogg's memoirs and a review of the 3 Perils of Women from the Blackwood's Edinburgh magazine. And it was kind of interesting, like looking at the different perceptions of Hogg. We talked a bit about biography and how what he'd written was quite an informal memoir, which was similar to Claire's style, and then kind of talked a bit about him sort of setting it up as establishing his literary identity, setting out his achievements, and kind of defending his career, and then an interesting thing with the relationship between Scott and Burns and how he'd originally sort of set himself up to emulate Burns and be like Burns, and yet when he actually starts his poetic career, it's kind of closer to following Scott's. We thought a bit about Edinburgh and that literary scene, and again how that was different to London in some ways, so it was more compact, there seemed to be more face-to-face interaction, and more of a mix of class happening, and a bit of a demotic drinking culture with certain publishers that seemed, not too conducive to good writing. We talked a bit about regionality and the difference between within Scotland, the Lowlands and the Highlands, and how the Highlanders wouldn't allow Hogg to publish some of their songs and write those down. And then kind of how Edinburgh belonged within the lowland culture. But then within that, Hogg's position was quite complex as well, because, although he was the lowlander going to Edinburgh, he was also the shepherd, and kind of defined as the shepherd by people writing his reviews. But then in fact, when he sort of hit on hard financial times and tried to go back home to be a shepherd, he was rejected from that, and so had to go back to Edinburgh and make his career as a poet. So sort of that kind of difficulty of assimilation within the 2 different spheres. And then we talked a bit about his comparison with Hazlitt in the review that Wilson wrote, and how Wilson kind of mocks Hogg a bit, but then also uses him to further criticise Hazlitt, and some strange dog analogy where if either man was going to fall in love, that Hazlitt would fall in love with a pug.
Or like a pug.
Or like a pug. And Hogg would do it like a Newfoundland. So kind of that sense that Hogg is like the essence of wildness, and so rather than being seen as a human, more as a sort of force of nature and the shepherd. And then finally we talked a bit about a moment in his review where, well, not in his review, in his biography, where he talks about as a young boy like getting hold of a violin and playing away badly, and listening to this professional player, well, like a professional musician, and then afterwards Hogg like plays away, and this musician is appalled and thinks it's the devil playing and can't work out what's happening, which we thought was quite interesting in thinking about, later on in his career and his relationship in parodying other poets when he writes The Poetic Mirror, and that kind of, complex relationship between him doing the parodies and what he's parodying, and the complex factors about why he does that, for humour, for finance reasons. Yeah, I think.
I think he also did that because he originally tried to get some of his contemporaries to write poems into an anthology or to Byron people, and they wouldn't do it, so he said, okay, I'll just parody them all.
Well, some of them agreed to do it. Wordsworth agreed to, and then never sent a poem. Others sent poems and asked for them back, and Scott point blank refused, which really upset Hogg. And Hogg didn't talk to Scott for nearly a year after that, and he had got no idea why Scott refused to do it, and then eventually they worked out that it was between them, that Scott just thought this was just not a good thing to be doing.
Well, we talked a little bit about that, about how certain things were expected of the Ettrick Shepherd.
Yeah.
One of them wasn't publishing a journal, the Spy, and one of them wasn't being an anthologist either.
Yeah.
I mean, his job was to write, a particular kind of native poetry that reflected his role as a shepherd and a Newfoundland dog, and talked a bit about masculinities and so on in relation to that.
Well, it's interesting that I can't remember who it is makes the point that John Wilson actually had a Newfoundland dog as a pet, which makes the analogy even more strange.
Rather than a poem.
Yeah. Emma. Jeff, Laura, Matthew and John.
Well, I'm apparently going to speak and can interject hopefully quite often. We did a really bad job of talking about Edinburgh, I'm afraid.
We've got the question. I think we did address the questions.
We did a top level question.
Yeah.
So we kind of... the humour thing came out in what we were talking about quite a lot as well, which perhaps we'll come on to in a minute, but the Trossachs is a kind of transitional place between England and sort of polite sensibility, as a sort of halfway house between the kind of real harsh Highlands. I was interested in quite what the Trossachs were like in the early 19th century, because you think of them now, they're actually quite gentrified, they're quite soft and relatively accessible compared to the really wild Highlands. And you kind of wonder how much it's sort of almost you can kind of map onto it a similar kind of effect where the Trossachs were a place that was sort of relatively safe and secure before they moved then on to sort of a much wilder, harsher climate. So sort of seeing the sublime from a safe distance in the Trossachs, and transitional figures within that, like a Highlander. And others we were kind of interested in. Also physiological disturbance, one sort of brought up a bit, entirely explored.
With the tourism, you made the point that on the one hand it's sort of built a certain kind of modern community in that region, but on the other hand, in the accounts that we get in Watson and in Hogg's account of his adventures in the area, you get very much a disjunction between the experience of the tourists and the communities who lived around there, who were very sceptical of the whole Lady of the Lake Scott effect in their region. So there are quite a lot of comic encounters along those lines, and Hogg's is one of them. He presents himself as a hapless tourist, but in doing so, he seems to be quite sort of disruptive of the myth which has grown up out of Scott's work. Yeah. He presents himself as a sort of buffoon attempting to gain sublime experience, but falling flat on his arse, sort of coming down the mountain. That was the physiological disturbance, wasn't it? That promised something otherworldly and timeless, but in the Lady of the Lake itself. But when it comes to the reality, it's something more pathetic. Yeah. And let me see, what's the other bit? Questions of class presumably come into that as well, and you get sort of quite amusing interviews between the Wordsworth anecdote was an example, wasn't it? The tourists who went the wrong way around the lake and were laughed at by the locals for attempting to recreate the Scott experience. They got into the wrong community, in other words. Yeah. Yeah. They hadn't followed the tourist community around the eastern side, is that right?
We also talked a bit about the location itself being both viewed through sort of many layers of kind of expectation based on other literary texts or other journeys or prior expectations of what it would be like, but also a sense that it's a place of absence, of things not being what you would expect, or of it being a culture that had already passed away, or of a nature that is in some way inadequate for the task. And even though the text focused strongly on the landscape, actually the other kind of encounter is very much with time. And again, the sense of possible disorientation that comes from being in the landscape, but also from being uncertainly situated with respect to different kinds of past history, mythical past, specific historical events, geological, natural time.
Yeah. With disorientation, it's kind of interesting. I like that kind of, the Wordsworth being, as it were, detoured. This kind of evacuation of the picturesque because of it reaching a point of saturation. So it's actually changed the landscape or mediated the landscape to the point of absurdity. And so in some ways, it's frail before its time in a way, but it's also negotiating the answer to the question about class.
That's also obviously in the Scottish context inflected not just by class, but notions of culture rather than simply by class. Cultural geographies as well. So the figure of the Highlander as both, as it were, standing on the side of Hug, offering a corrective to the bourgeois aesthetic, but also subject to, of course, as is so often the case, a form of superstition. So you get one form of so what you don't get is any kind of neutral position, rather like Friel. You're not allowed to get back to a point of naturalised origination, but you're encouraged to think about that dynamic interplay between those competing versions of what identity and its relationship to the landscape actually is.
Okay. So finally, Greg, Jeremy, Sarah, Jennifer, and David. And Georgina.
So we had what we kept coming back to was the identity of being Scottish and creating an identity for a Scottish magazine, literary magazine, which is against Cockneys, it's versus Cockneys, but at the same time it celebrates the divisions in Scottish culture. So divisions between Whig and Tory, Highland, Lowland, Highland, etc. And then we pondered a little while what sort of, a kind of board of lawyers. So they would approach criticism in a different way. It's very adversarial sort of criticism. And this is part of creating an identity, which is a saleable commercial identity, which the purchasers would invest in and enjoy, so perhaps it's part of a sort of Scottish commercialism as well as national identity, which everybody is quite happy with, even though they seem to argue about it. Whereas the criticism of Lamb and Coleridge was more genial and more kind of gentle and sort of humanist and different. So then through Noctes Ambrosianus, maybe it's the idea of promoting a private brotherhood, but public dissenting or arguing with each other, which is very important, the idea of the personal and the public. In dialogue, which is really important because there doesn't seem to be a big theatre review section, and this is sort of theatre. And by doing dialogue, you're putting words into people's mouths and you're controlling what they say, and you're also getting a kind of lovely character difference between them. So this is an important aspect of it. We nearly had a very interesting conversation about Mother Goose and nostalgia, but we kind of left that. Then we went on to, the Blackwoods were famous for engaging with Cockneys, which seemed to then take over part of our discussion because, because the Cockney kind of dialect is very visual on the page because of the wherry thing, very for wherry. And let me see, I'm sure I'm missing loads of this stuff now.
We wondered what Cockneys were, because Cockneys came up in our texts, and it seemed to be like a generic name for anyone south of Watford, is that what you meant?
That was just some prejudice.
It didn't seem to be restricted to, say, East End,
but I think
people who said Wherry.
But they have a look to them as well, don't they, Cockneys? Because they usually have very fat wives if you look at the print.
I can talk about this for hours. You don't really want this. You're going to regret this, aren't you?
Cockney characters on stage. The revival of The Waterman, which is a kind of Cockney play from 1779, was kind of brought out again towards the, I don't know what date it was brought out again, but it was brought out again in the 19th century. So that kind of relates to visions of what Cockneys might be. And the last thing I remember saying myself was that there's a ceramic of The Waterman which would have probably still been in people's cabinets, from 1745 or something onward. Their granddads probably kept it, and it was probably some of their cabinets. So there might still have been an issue around, celebrating this figure, this Waterman figure, which is pugilism. We also mentioned, which is part of because the Waterman's pugilist, but it's also part of dialogue, to have pugilistic dialogue, and to use that as a new image in the way that people speak to each other.
There's the Blackwoods, I was saying that they come to theatre reviewing very late, 1818, and then it's only in London that it's only intermittently, whereas lots of the other literary magazines are doing that. And I just happen to have in my notes there's an extraordinary essay on pugilism, poetry, statuary, and painting. And we were saying here that that kind of pugilistic, violence is kind of under the surface of the magazine. Adversarial.
There's always there's always a chance that something you write in a magazine is going to get you into a fight, isn't there? Charles Saatchi has called out a journalist for cage fight, hasn't he? Over something that was written about him and Nigella.
We could find that back in Pope's day, isn't it? We had to arm himself with pistols, after publishing the Dunciad.
Yeah.
And it was all that, quite often people got beaten up for what was written in.
Yeah.
I guess that's the thing, though, if you actually investigate it in print, it might be safer in the end, because especially if you're emphasising that people can spend perfectly happily, 3 hours in a tavern talking and arguing, if you kind of investigate all the things that they're unhappy about with each other in print safely, then maybe you might not need to pick up and write about it afterwards. That's that kind of theatrical expose of conflict, and afterwards everybody's happy and go home. But maybe it's the same as that.
I think that's an really interesting question, isn't it? The extent to which people have written quite a lot about periodical wars in the last few years, and the extent to which, at times, as you say, they act as a sort of safety valve, that sort of antagonism, and the times where where for whatever reason it spills over into real life, into real life duels and deaths in some cases. And it's a very difficult balance, I think, that a journal like that practice is trying to reach there.
Well, I think there's also the other side to that, isn't it? That, I mean, I think people writing about it, using that metaphor of journalism as a kind of fight contest as pugilism. But there's also, I mean, people talking in a tavern. I mean, boxing would be one of the things that they would be in a tavern talking about.
Yeah.
Anyway, because
yes,
it's the most popular thing that's happening at that time. I mean, Scott laments the fact that in terms of sales of prints and things, and compared to books, that some of the key pugilists of the time massively outsell anything that by 1820, anything that he might write.
Yeah.
I mean, so there's a great phrase about one black bruiser is worth 100 golden poets or whatever. Which is about Bill Richmond. But I mean, it's that so it's in the ether as well as being used as a metaphor. I just want to say that it's out there. It's the Premier League football of its time.
In Edinburgh as much as London.
Yeah, and I think the part of the contest that's going on there is that John Wilson and Blackwood want to take that opportunity. What they can't stand is the likes of William Hazlitt is known to be interested, and Byron, of course, interested in sparring and boxing. So they want to put their stamp of their version of national identity upon pugilism. And therefore, John Wilson sets about writing a whole number of articles using that analogy of the great fighters of a particular of different kinds as a kind of version of the canon. I mean, but there are a whole set of articles, over about the first 8-9 years of Blackwood's, doing precisely that and doing in the Cockney's version of it, which is scurrilous and less heroic. What we don't want is these lefties getting hold of it. This is kind of our version of Tory national identity.
Well, thanks, Simon, for setting this up.